What were the key events that led to the start of the American Revolution in 1775? Who were the militia, and how were they organized? How well prepared were the American colonists to take on the strongest military in the world at the time? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the creation of the colonial militia and events that led to the start of the American Revolution through the convening of the First Continental Congress in 1774. Joining me for this discussion is Army historian Joseph Seymour. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, Lee. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, great having you here. And I know you're an expert in the colonial era, the Rev War, so I'm excited to get your insights on these topics. But before we go there, just want to tell everyone a little bit about you. So Joe was born and raised in the Philadelphia area. He attended Lewis and Clark College, the Pennsylvania State University, the University of Edinburgh, and Temple University, earning a bachelor's and master's degree in history. While in Scotland, he served as an intern at the home headquarters of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. He inventoried the regimental manuscript collection and learned about the British Army's regimental system. He also served in Troop A, 1st Squadron of the 104th Cavalry Regiment, Pennsylvania Army National Guard, and worked as an Army historian since 2004. His primary professional focus is on organizational history, the history and culture of the American soldier in the 18th century, and the evolution of small arms and tactics in that era. Representative works include the Pennsylvania Associators, 1747 to 1777, Light the Match, Load Away, the Ordnance and Organizational Structure of the Philadelphia Artillery from 1747 to 1777, American Society of Arms Collectors Bulletin, May-June of 2006, and a chart showing the results of a 1779 Woolwich ballistic test, military collector and historian, in winter of 2013. Well, that's a lot of work. You definitely have the credibility in this era. So, Joe, we've got the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution coming up, big anniversaries. But before we get into the revolution, we really have to address what got us there. So let's start by talking about how the military in the American colonies was organized at that time. And was it the same throughout all the colonies?
Yeah, Lee, that's a really interesting question. And when a lot of people think about the colonial militia, of course, they think about the rustic farmer laying the plow aside and taking up his musket, usually wearing his shirt sleeves and very little else. Mm-hmm. But in fact, the militia, as we know it, is a result of legal mandates that go back to the 1100s. And it is also the result of technical and tactical requirements on the part of subjects and citizens in the English-speaking world dating back to that time. In 1189, the Assize, or the Law of Arms of Henry II, dictated that English subjects bear arms in defense of the realm. Subsequent ordinances mandated not only the ownership of arms, and of course in the 1100s we're talking about spears and swords, but also proficiency in their use. The famed English longbow wasn't just something that people kept to put food on the table, but it was also a very powerful and advanced weapon that required years and years of training. And in order to ensure that England had large numbers of archers in service, various successive monarchs required not only the ownership of bow staves, that is the bows themselves, but proficiency in their learning. And so if you owned a home, you were not only required to be able to put an arrow into a target from as far away as 220 yards, you were also required to raise your children, your young children, or what they called in the law the man-child, in their use and proficiency.
Oh, wow.
It's a lot of fun to go through these old legal texts and ordinances. You find interesting terminology, but you start to see this pattern.
What were the ages that were required at that time? Like, did you have to be 15 or older, or when would you be conscripted if needed?
Yeah, that's actually what I was just about to get to there. I mean, with the longbow, you had to learn at a very much younger age, which is one of the reasons why by the 17th century, matchlock and flintlock muskets replaced items like the longbow. They required a lot less training. And were cheaper in terms of the labor required and the skill levels required, although they required more technology in terms of smelting metals and the use of flint and other substances like gunpowder. And by the 17th century, when England began to colonize North America, most laws on the books required training as a foot soldier. The early colonial charters, generally, all of them required that the subjects of the colonies provide defense for their colony, or in the result of war, in defense of the sovereign, the king or the queen, as it were. And generally speaking, all of these colonies had some sort of militia law on the books. All but one colony, in fact, had some sort of militia law on the books that mandated military service. And it was usually able-bodied males. 16 or 18 was usually the minimum age at which you had to turn out for militia service. And generally speaking, 45, 53, 65 was usually the upper end. Officers...
So most of their lives.
Most of the lives you were required to turn out for the militia. And it was something that fathers passed down to son, and that towns and counties, now depending on how the colony was organized, it may have been a county requirement. New England was structured around small towns, hamlets, townships, and so the town was a very close-knit community that required service. So it was not only a military obligation, but a social obligation. And soldiers were required to show proficiency in their arms. And as I said, all but one colony had mandatory service on its books. One colony, Maryland, actually required women to possess arms if they were the head of a household.
Oh, okay.
So the idea was it was considered something that cost money and time, and now that women did not turn out for militia service, but they were required to bear arms, at least keep them. Let's not say keep arms, but bearing arms was something different. So again, these laws are interesting because they play out into the modern time.
And so you talked a lot about the homes, the communities. So how were they organized? Was one community a company or a platoon? If they used those terms back then.
That's a good question. They did use the terms company and platoon. Some of the terms were used a little differently, but a lot of modern soldiers would see a lot of parallels to what we do today. Generally speaking, there were a few different types of colonies, and how they were legally structured had a lot to do with how their militia was structured. Now, in a colony like Virginia, for example, the militia was based around the county. Okay. So you would have a county regiment, and then various companies, because it was a very decentralized population, that various companies would be assigned therein. Now, Massachusetts had a very high population, a very densely settled population, and also a very rigorously structured government. So their militia was structured around the town. In fact, we talk about town companies in New England. And in 1636, the town companies of Massachusetts were all consolidated into regiments: the North, the South, and the East Regiment. The North Regiment being the area of Boston and Middlesex County, the South Regiment being what we call Suffolk County, and then the East Regiment being Essex County up around Newburyport, Cape Ann area. And so within the militia structure, you also had a very well-structured tactical formation. So you had regimental colonels, you had regimental staff, you had captains of town companies. Now, a small town, say, for example, there was a little town in Middlesex County called Lexington that had, that would maybe only have one or two companies, whereas a bigger town like Concord nearby, the county seat, had more companies. It varied, and then Boston would have more companies still. And now, militia service, militia service was compulsory, and and you had to turn out. So you also had more elite structures, especially in areas like Boston or Newport, Rhode Island, New Haven, Connecticut. But let's focus a little bit on Massachusetts now, where you would have volunteer militia organizations that would have more structure, more equipment, uniforms, colors, all of the trappings of a regular organization, and many of Boston's elites, like John Hancock, for example, who was considered, I think, if not the richest, one of the richest men in Massachusetts, they would belong to these organizations. Henry Knox belonged to a militia organization. He was a bookseller, but also belonged to a militia organization.
When I think of comparison to today, so I was active duty in the Army, but I was also a reservist for many years. Our obligation was 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks annually. How did that compare to the militia back then?
Well, it varied. Sometimes, depending on basically the distance that you were from the military threat, it could be as infrequently as once a year, though most colonies had at least a quarterly muster. And in Massachusetts, where wars were frequent and the military threat was constant, it could be as frequently as once a month, or as tensions grew over the various oppressive acts of the British ministry, it could become very frequent. And it varied.
Well, let's talk about how these militia were put into action. The French and Indian War, I think, is a good example. So talk about how they were mobilized to fight that war.
Yeah, sure. And again, a lot of people tend to lump the militia into a lot of other military organizations that existed in the colonies. Now, during various, during the various colonial wars, and of course, in Boston, these wars, they started as early as the 1630s, the Pequot War, later King Philip's War. Occasionally, you would have the militia called into service. Now, in the early years, it would be the town militia would be ordered into service by the General Court, which was the legislature of Massachusetts. The General Court would order the militia into service. Then later, it was found by the 1750s, say, the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, it's called variously. By that period, you had they understood that there was a shortcoming in calling militia up constantly. Now, that calling up militia constantly put a great deal of stress on these communities to engage in their agricultural and manufacturing. It put pressure on shipping. New England was very highly dependent on the maritime trade, not only for commerce, but trade various places around the British Empire, but also for fishing. Right. New Englanders were relying on fishing. So what New England, the other colonies determined was that out of these militia organizations, they could raise levies for provincial servants. Now, levies might be for a contingency operation, such as the expedition to Louisburg in 1745, 1746, where elements of New England militia went under Sir William Pepperell and William Shirley against the French fortress in the Maritimes, or and then they would serve temporarily and return to service. Or another solution was to raise provincial regiments for service, for example, at Crown Point, Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain and Lake George. These were soldiers serving for a fixed term of service, and they would start to look very much like our modern Reserve or National Guard.
Oh, wow.
And they were very much full-time soldiers, paid regularly, often uniformed and equipped, and serving alongside regulars, serving in auxiliary roles, what we would call force protection, or doing patrolling or guarding supply trains and things like that, which made a lot of sense because you could take the fully trained, long-serving regulars and have them performing the job of performing the actual instruments of policy, going out and fighting French regulars and their allies. Other provincials would follow suit. Massachusetts had a great deal of success with the so-called snowshoemen. We often talk about colonial rangers. Now, there's one very famous organization of colonial rangers, Rogers Rangers, but there were many others. To range was we think now of rangers as contingency soldiers, deep penetrating raids, that sort of things. And rangers did occasionally do that sort of work. But to range meant to simply patrol between fortified strong points. Oh, okay. And this is a concept that actually started in Ireland in the 17th century. And was brought over here. And so rangers would, you'd have these forts out on the frontier, and they'd be separated by 10 or 20 miles. Well, if you're a Canadian raider, it's real obvious. You just pick one that's isolated, raid it, and then before anybody knows it, they're not going to have time to react. Whereas if there are rangers who are always in motion between the forts, you can provide a lot more security. So, hey, you hear shots popping off a few miles away. You can easily spread the alarm. You think about, they would have big signal beacons of flames that would go up, or signal guns, that sort of thing, bells. And that's going to play out at the Battle of Lexington.
So out of some of these colonial wars, the 7 Years' War, French-Indian War, a lot of the people who would serve in the Revolutionary War, and some of our leaders were taking part in those. So talk a little bit about how those wars were really a training ground for command.
Yeah, without a doubt, Lee, without a doubt. And when you look at the resumes of our Revolutionary War leaders, it is almost to a man. They had some sort of prior service, as we say in the military. Of course, at the top, you've got George Washington. He was at Fort Necessity in July of 1754. He was with Braddock. Actually, he was at Braddock's side when he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Monongahela on 9 July 1755, as was Major General Thomas Gage, who was the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America. So Thomas Gage was absolutely no stranger to American military talent, but that's as an aside.
Or to Washington, I guess.
Wow. So if they never met, it might be odd. So there's this idea that, Horatio Gates, Arthur Sinclair, and even down at the lower end, Israel Putnam of Massachusetts was I'm sorry, he wasn't a Massachusetts man, but Israel Putnam was he had been a ranger in colonial period. So these were old soldiers, a lot of them. William Heath, but even soldiers who had seen no action, like John Parker of Lexington, had served in the militia for a very long period of time. So, and the period of especially 1755 to 1759 was a watershed of new ideas, new tactical concepts coming into the British Army. And you had some real leadership in the British Army, some really famous generals, and they were famous for a reason. They were highly competent, highly talented leaders. Lord George Howe, Sir William Howe's older brother, was a great friend of the colonists. He was killed right before the failed attempt on Fort Carillon, which was later Fort Ticonderoga in 1758. But he was a man who appreciated the work of American colonial rangers, such as Robert Rogers. And this was also the time when the British were learning to use Highland troops, light infantry. William Howe led light infantry, as did Thomas Gage during the 7 Years' War. And American soldiers were seeing this happen. Hey, we can leave our baggage train behind. We can pack it on our backs. We're not going to rely on cold steel bayonet charges. We can carry hatchets. We can rely more on our musketry. We can walk in single file so that we're harder to track. We can learn to sleep on the ground. A lot of things that modern American soldiers really take for granted was coming into its own at the time. So and also 1755 is the real start off of the French and Indian War. That's only 20 years before Lexington. And so when you think, okay, we can look around the room and say, okay, so a soldier who's still in his prime at 45 years old, say like George Washington was, a soldier who's in his prime in 1755 was a young soldier at that time and had learned through this. So I would say definitely as a schoolhouse, as a military schoolhouse, the 7 Years' War in America was very significant. I think I rambled a bit, but
no, that was good. Great information. And so now moving forward, we have in order to pay for the French and Indian War, Britain, the Parliament took some action. So if you want to talk about that.
So I did talk about a lot of the cost that the colonists undertook to fight the colonial wars. And full disclosure, I'm an unabashed fan of the Continentals. I'm not a secretly sympathize. I like the English; they're nice people, but I'm an American. Mm-hmm. The War for Empire, the 7 Years' War, was a brilliant conflict. William Pitt was a talented, one of the great prime ministers of Great Britain. And James Wolfe, the great general at Quebec, fought a global war against Great Britain's enemies in coalition with Prussia and other countries. This came at enormous cost. Mm-hmm. And in the aftermath of the victory, the Peace of Paris ended the 7 Years' War in 1763. And in the aftermath of that, Great Britain, to put it lightly, had a lot of bills to pay. Not just financial, but political. And so to do so, Great Britain had a vast new empire. They had finally, once and for all, conquered New France. And the French, for the most part, had said, okay, that's over as long as we keep some lucrative islands in the Caribbean and fishing rights on the Grand Banks, we're okay. Though they harbored a lot of desire for revenge. So that would require an army to patrol new force, and that would also require just simply paying off of debts, paying off of all those contractors and commissaries and other things. So to do so, Parliament said, well, these are just colonists somewhere. These colonies are here to provide income for the empire, so why don't we tax these people who are here? Now, a couple of things going on here. One is that the great commoner, as he was called, Sir William Pitt, was no longer running things. He liked Americans. He understood Americans, and Americans understood him, which is why we have so many towns named Pitt. Pittsburgh being probably the most prominent, but Pittsfield in Massachusetts. And if you look around, you'll see them. So he's gone, and the new ministry said, well, okay, these are just common people. They're nothing to us, so let's tax them. And they won't mind because we'll tax manufactured items that, luxury items, things like that. They won't really see the tax. Well, these people hadn't been to the American colonies. They hadn't seen our colleges and universities. They hadn't seen places like Harvard, and they hadn't seen New York City, and they didn't see the great deal of sophistication that was in American society, and they certainly hadn't come up against the likes of people like John Hancock and John Adams, Samuel Adams, and they had met Benjamin Franklin, but they hadn't really seen what he could do yet. And so they just didn't understand that Americans thought a great deal about law and philosophy and government. And so when they imposed a series of duties on various items, iron, paper, glass, paint pigments, the list goes on, and of course, the tea tax.
Right.
More on that in a minute. They just didn't understand what the backlash was going to be. And as I think I've already alluded to, Americans felt members of an empire. Americans were proud to be members of the empire. Americans fired salutes. They put up statues to King George III. They named towns after William Pitt and James Wolfe and Admiral Warren, and we're British.
Right. Yeah.
And
proudly British.
Proudly British, and now you are going to make us pay? Well, we have assemblies.
Right.
We do tax ourselves, and we did bear the burden of the war. And here you are treating us like we do nothing.
So these are additional taxes over and above what they're already paying to the local governments here in the colonies at the time.
People paid their taxes. Right. People served in the militia. If you skipped drill, you got fined.
Right. So it wasn't that they were just opposed to taxes in general. They were opposed to paying these new additional taxes, which are going to put a heavy burden on them.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Lee. As people often say, well, they just didn't want to pay taxes. No, they were willing to pay their taxes. And they were certainly showed that they were willing to pay their fair share. Yeah.
Right. So these led to a lot of resentment now, growing resentment within the colonies. And, we've all heard of the Boston Massacre.
Yes.
So I think this led to that. So talk a little bit about that. What happened there, and how, what was the impact it had on the growing resistance?
Yeah, that's a really important. So March of 1770, there were British troops in Boston enforcing tax duties, and they were serving far from home, under-equipped, poorly equipped. They were wearing a mixed match of older uniform parts, newer uniform parts. Every soldier can identify with that. And one very cold night, as we can imagine what Boston's like in March, there was a guard post guarding the customs house in Boston, and it started the way many things of this sort start. some boys were taunting British soldiers and throwing slush balls at them. And just to skip ahead, there's a whole lot of detail. I could take an hour to tell all the details and the back and forth.
But it's all due to the growing resentment.
It's due to the growing resentment, and eventually a large crowd formed, and the British captain, the captain of the guard was called, Captain Preston was called in. He tried to restore order. No one's ever really going to be sure exactly what happened, but again, more on that in a minute. Before anyone really knew, the British soldiers fired into the crowd. The crowd was getting close. The crowd was getting ugly. Sticks and stones were flying, and so the soldiers responded with musketry, and several Bostonians lay dead. And this absolutely galvanized Bostonians, and the word spread through the colonies of this bloody massacre, as it was called. A young leader of the resistance by the name of Paul Revere, who was in his own right a renowned silversmith, did an engraving for the massacre that occurred, that appeared in Boston papers. We've seen these. And this is also a really important time to note that the information campaign was something that the Americans had very well in hand. One of the biggest printers, and a newspaper printer. A printer was somebody who was more than just a newspaper printer. He was somebody who did all sorts of information technology. So he also controlled how news got around. One of the biggest, of course, was Benjamin Franklin, who had retired from the business, by the way. But there was a whole network, including his brother in Boston, and so the means by which information could flow throughout the colonies was very rapid, and also occurred in many different ways. So the leadership could correspond by letter. People could read newspapers or have them read to them if they could not read. Taverns were meeting places. Many of the leaders of the resistance were tradesmen and masons like Paul Revere, and so they could easily move in quiet circles and secret circles among the taverns and get this information out. And they could also shape the way information was relayed, so they could put their own spin on this event. So Americans who had lingering opinions of the regulars to begin with, some of them good, some of them bad. Now, I'm not going to say that it was all negative, but they saw these people as oppressive, and this may not have been the case in a place like Philadelphia, but it was something that now galvanized people, that the ministry and the crown was willing to use force in something that was really an English tradition of protesting by, well, we're going to throw rocks at you, or we're going to tar and feather you. That's very English, actually. Going back to the resistance, the great legend of, you thought I wasn't done with longbows, but the great legend of Robin Hood. So this idea, it's just.
But this is now word's getting throughout all the colonies.
Yeah.
So it's not just Boston or Massachusetts that's getting the resentment. Now
it's starting to spread.
It's spreading there.
And you've got committees of correspondence, various, all down into, from Boston to New Haven to Newport to New York to Princeton to Philadelphia, Williamsburg. Don't forget the lower colonies of Delaware. All the way down, you've got concerned, prominent people who read.
Right.
Who are saying, this is not who we are. This is, we have the rule of law. We don't do this, and we're going to now have committees of correspondence where we're going to share ideas about how we should resist.
Okay.
How we should resist.
Did this impact the militias at all?
Absolutely. One of the things is that the militia is the nation in arms. It's a single entity, and it's a legal requirement. So you had militia organizations throughout the colonies. Now this is 1770, so it's one isolated incident at this point. But within 2 years, you're going to have the Gaspé incident. And then you're going to have escalation. But what first happens is Britain slowly has been repealing these various taxes. Okay. So there's a sense on the ministry's part saying, okay, we've gone a little too far with this. And really, it's not a building tide yet.
Right.
Now, what does also come out of the Boston Massacre is that the soldiers are charged with murder.
Okay, the British soldiers, right. Okay.
And they are tried in a Massachusetts court. Now, if you're a British soldier who's used to getting spit on and having rocks thrown at him, how do you think you're going to be treated in a Boston court?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So, a very young hotshot lawyer by the name of John Adams represents the regulars. Now, he did fairly well. He didn't get them off for nothing. 2 of them were convicted of manslaughter and branded.
Oh, wow.
It's the way we did things back then. Cruel and unusual punishment was a little different, but they were branded for manslaughter. But they were not all railroaded, as we would say now. Back then, no one said that. But they were not. It was not a drumhead court. It was a court of law, and they were found. Several were acquitted, and some were convicted. And what it showed to these committees of correspondence that this is a country, this is a rule of law, and Adams was not pro-British,
right?
But he believed in this pro-law.
Yeah.
So the idea is this growing idea of what is our authority, and you asked about what it does to the militia. Is the militia, as I said, is a legal mandate.
Yeah.
You are legally required to serve. And so there's this idea that this is a legal resistance. It is not, as you said, people just not wanting to pay their taxes.
Right.
It's not, we just don't want to do what the British want to do. This is, we are in the right.
Yes.
We are upholding the law. It is the British ministry that is not. So, as I said, what comes out is a period of de-escalation.
Okay.
But
you said they started repealing a lot of the taxes.
Yeah.
But the one tax that they didn't repeal was what?
Was what? The tea tax.
The tea tax.
And there's a sense here of, okay, we'll repeal all the taxes, but one little measly tax. And this was done in part to prop up the failing East India Company. It was the tax was imposed. Okay, we're going to subsidize the East India Company. We're going to give these pesky Americans the tea that is cheaper than they're going to get anywhere else, so they can drink all the tea they want, and get all riled up. But they're getting it at a cheaper price. So again, the British are saying, "Oh, this is just about money," but we're going to impose this one little tax on tea, and Americans didn't buy it. They didn't buy the tax, and their response was, "We're not going to buy the tea."
Yeah.
The idea was, if the tea was landed, it wasn't the idea. This is the way duties work.
Right.
You land your tea. You pay the import duty. Well, once the import duty is paid, the tax is paid.
Okay.
And then it is passed on to the consumers. Well, if the tea is landed, the tax is paid. If the tea is not landed,
Right.
so how do we keep the ships from landing the tea? Now, in some places, the tea was burned, and there are a number of what we call tea parties. Tea party is sort of a later
Was
term.
this throughout the colonies, or
Yeah.
was this just focused in Massachusetts? Okay.
But the big one, the first one, the important one, the ships that were sailing to Philadelphia turned around.
Oh, really? Okay.
They negotiated with the owners and said, just turn around. But in Boston, they were sitting in the harbor, 3 ships. And so on the night of 16 December 1773, a mysterious party of Indians descended on Boston Harbor and threw the tea overboard.
Right.
They did not steal it. Stealing would have been theft, would have been an act of a criminal act.
Oh.
They did not damage the ships. They only took the tea out of the chests and threw it into the harbor. Now, of course, these were simply disguised Sons of Liberty, as they were called, the resistance groups, and they were probably included some people that later became famous. We do know the names of a few of those members, and they were just young revolutionaries. And now this, again, when news arrived in London of this destruction of the tea, as it was called at the time, or what we now call the Tea Party, the response was swift and severe.
Yeah, and how did it impact the militia?
This is really where you start to see a real uptick in not only in the militia but also in its political arms as well. What the British now do is they pass a series of acts to punish and to repay the tea that was lost. And Americans responded to these acts, which were severe. It was basically the imposition of martial law, the arrival of British regiments.
The intolerable acts.
The coercive acts, the intolerable acts. We're going to close the port of Boston. Now think about that for a minute.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm getting to your question. Think about the closure of the Boston port. Boston relies, the port is Boston's lifeblood. You're basically trying to starve the city, throwing everybody out of work, including young men of military age.
Yeah.
We're going to take any offenses that are committed by British officials, British soldiers. We're going to try them in England, the Administration of Justice Act.
Oh.
Even though Americans had shown that you could get a fair trial in New England, we're going to take the Massachusetts government. We're going to dissolve the General Court.
Wow.
And we're going to place a military governor in charge, Thomas Gage. And so what these acts essentially did was they placed Massachusetts under martial law.
Wow.
They took away its charter. They took away its government essential rights. They quartered British soldiers on people in people's homes. So now there's a British sergeant's going to come live with you, and you can barely even understand him. He can't understand you. And so this is an absolute outrage. Now, all of these people that are thinking about law and justice and philosophy are now saying that's gone. And so what you have is throughout New England, but also throughout the colonies, now you have training and organization and reorganization of existing militia that is now taken up in earnest.
Yeah, and with the state of emergency, if you will, that was in Massachusetts and through some of the other colonies, there were shadow governments now popping up.
Absolutely.
Right. Which eventually, so you have shadow state governments, but now there's a consolidation of all 13 colonies. Or I think they tried others as well, but so this leads to the Continental Congress.
Yeah, this is the Massachusetts formed a provisional government, and the government met in the biggest nearby city or town rather, in Concord, and
Which is what, about 18, 20 miles outside of Boston?
about 20 miles.
20 miles,
about
okay.
20 miles. And so we're going to now, as Massachusetts Bay Staters, we're going to say, Bay, it wasn't the state yet, but Massachusetts Bay people, we're going to now we're going to have our own government because the one that exists is not legitimate.
Right.
It is not legal. In other colonies throughout 1774, revolutionary committees, the committees of correspondence now grow into revolutionary committees. They hold elections and they elect new representatives to their assemblies. In Pennsylvania in 1774, new political novices. They had never held office before, are now swept into government.
Oh, wow.
In some places, the royal governments held on and were swept out. You have in Virginia and New York. In other places, in at least one colony, Connecticut, the royal governor Jonathan Trumbull goes along with the revolution. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, that's an interesting story.
Yeah.
He says, "Well, no, I'm one of you guys." So now you have these what had been committees of correspondence, but they are elected for the most part. Right. These are, George Washington is an elected Burgess.
Okay. Yeah.
So again, there's legitimacy here. But they are now running. You could call to shadow. They're shadowing what's going on, and they are now they are now becoming in their eyes and in the eyes of many of their supporters, they are the duly legitimate government, and that this is about legality and about status.
By the end of 1774 or thereabouts, just to describe the state of readiness, the weapons, the tactics of the militia.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, because there is a long militia tradition and service, there were a lot of people that knew what they were doing. And so one of the things I'll throughout the colonies there is an arms race, but I'm just going up. Let me focus on Massachusetts. The provisional government of Massachusetts does start to gather and collect arms. They start to there's small but growing capability to produce arms, but it's mostly taking surplus arms. There were a lot of surplus arms left over from the French and Indian War. There was the requirement to own and possess a musket, but also you had artillery companies throughout the colony. Gunpowder, which had to be brought in from abroad, was a high commodity, and so there is. So the revolutionaries are stockpiling it. One of the big areas to do it is in Concord. Militia companies and regiments are now stepping up their training. It is now much more frequent throughout the winter of 1774. They have authorized minute companies.
Okay, so this is the first we're hearing of these minute companies, or what would become Minutemen. Yeah.
Now the tradition, as I said, goes back, but so the idea of having these younger, 18 to 35-year-old soldiers who are what we would call a rapid reaction force. So they can turn out in a minute's notice. Maybe not quite that quickly, but the idea is that they can turn out quickly. And so, if there's an alarm, I talked about that with the old ranging companies. The British are going after, and they did. The British raided Salem, what's called the powder alarm. There was a stockpile there. The British raided. The militia did not react fast enough, and so the British were successful. So this is not going to happen again. If there's an alarm. If the regulars march, we're going to have a system of signaling from Boston, where they're all concentrated, And if they march out or come out or go out in boats, the British were good at amphibious operations. If we do that, we're going to have an alarm system and an early warning system. Okay. And these Minutemen will be equipped. They've got their muskets, their bayonets, their knapsacks.
First line of defense.
Right. Yeah. And so they are, and they're the youngest, the most agile. They're the ones who have the most frequent training, and they will be able to get out first until the battalions and regiments can turn out behind them.
Would you consider them officially part of the militia?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
They're select soldiers within the militia.
So
regiment.
they're not separate. They're just okay. Gotcha.
And they're integrated into the communities. They're not living in barracks or things like that.
And one other question: you mentioned Sons of Liberty earlier. Was that part of the militia, or was that more of a political action group? How would you define them?
Yes.
Okay.
It's kind of both. Okay. Sons of Liberty they were political action groups. Mm-hmm. But many members of the revolutionary leadership, so you would have the political committees, the revolutionary committees within towns. Mm-hmm. And this is why the revolution is so successful is you have a political structure that also has a military structure. As I said, Joseph Warren, who's a leader of the revolution, also comes out as a volunteer soldier, and he's nominally got a rank of a general, but he never assumed that rank because he knew, hey, I'm a doctor. Yeah. But the idea was you could be a leading revolutionary, as George Washington was, member of the Continental Congress, but also a soldier.
Well, Joe, this has been fascinating, but we're going to have to start wrapping this up. But before we close, it's time for our segment that we normally call Whoa Trivia, but since this is Revolutionary War talk, it's Huzzah Trivia. So do you have a piece of trivia that you can share with us about the militia prior to the American Revolution?
Sure. On that fateful morning, the redcoats that marched to Washington were volunteers, but the militia were conscripts.
So there's a difference. Just quickly, what is the difference?
Well, conscript is there because they have mandatory service. They were called out by their committees, and the British regulars were almost always volunteers at this point.
All right, well, good. Well, thank you so much, Joe. This has been fascinating. A lot of great information here, especially seeing how our American Army that would get established in 1775 is developing through the years, and what led up to the start of hostilities in 1775 for the American Revolution. So thank you for your insights today about the history of the militia and the events that led to the American Revolution. And if anyone wants to learn more about this challenging time in American military history and the American Revolution, or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And we have a new website that's you can access from our main website that's specifically dedicated to the American Army in the Revolutionary War. Also, we have a series of new pamphlets that are coming out. A lot of them are already released, and the information we're talking about today is in our first pamphlet called Opening Shots. So I'd highly encourage you to check that out. And if you want to learn more or experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.